Hello, everybody, and welcome. This week we are going to continue discussing corrections, but really taking a different twist on it and talk about how corrections is handled in the juvenile justice system. Now, if you have had the class juvenile justice, some of this is going to be very, very familiar to you, so will essentially be a refresher of some of those issues. If you have not had juvenile justice yet, then you can basically consider this a preview of some of the things that we talk about in juvenile justice. Because it is quite comprehensive, this particular material applies to all of the performance objectives of the class. And so today we're going to be specifically talking about assessment, probation, institutionalization, parole, and treatment. So all familiar topics in this class, but how they apply to the juvenile justice system. So let's go ahead and dig right in. With juveniles, we still want to be providing good assessment and classification. We've talked about that quite a bit already as it applies to adult corrections. Juvenile corrections is no different. We still have similar goals as far as custody. If the person is going to be in an institution, if a juvenile is going to be in an institution or referred to a specific program, we might want to make sure that we assess their risks as far as determining what level of custody is appropriate for this particular child. That's also going to lead us to determining what level of supervision the juvenile needs. That risk assessment, again, determining on what their risk is for violence, for compliance, for maybe running away or not following through with the program. It's all going to fall under that supervision, and we're going to learn some of that through that risk assessment and really looking at some of the safety issues. Then lastly, we're going to be assessing to determine treatment. And again, that's when we talk about risk and needs assessment. Treatment is really going to come through on that needs assessment, where that's going to allow us, for instance, if the person assesses as needing chemical dependency treatment, that's going to be a need. However, remember, as we talked about in prior weeks, sometimes that risk assessment is also going to give us some pretty good ideas of what treatment needs the person might have as well. Now, in adult corrections, I introduced you to the LSCMI. That was that level of service inventory that specifically assessed risk and needs of adults. We have a juvenile version of that as well, and it basically is created the same way. It's looking for the same variables. The only difference here is that it also takes into consideration more education needs, where the adult talks about more about employment. This too does cover employment for juveniles, but focuses more on education because a lot of times that's mainly where the focus of kids are. It also is going to look more at family situation and look more of that on the assessment tool. But it still has those four principles. The one that I don't have on here is the override. I'll explain that in just a minute. So essentially what, again, it's looking at the risks, what are their security needs, what are their needs as far as programming. Then it's going to look at their needs. And again, similar to the adult assessment, it's going to be looking at those dynamic factors. These are things that can change. It's also going to look at static factors. These, again, are things that happened in the past that we can't change, however, is going to influence what plan we have for them. The needs is also going to be very much focused on their strengths. And again, a lot of times a need area, if it's not identified as a need, it may be insight then into what is one of their strengths. And we always want to give kids, positive affirmation. And, if this particular person is, age-wise a sophomore and their educational level, what they're testing at, meets that sophomore level, that's a strength. You are right on board with, or right on line, you're in line with where you should be on your, or in your educational journey. And so that's a strength. The third principle is that responsivity. We talked about this again when talking about or dealing with adults, and this is taking into consideration some of those individual factors. And so if they have a learning disability or something in there that they've identified with their learning style, we want to be responsive to that. And that's why it's called responsivity. We want to make sure we are accommodating those specific needs for this particular child. And then the last one is often referred to, let me just go ahead and type it in here. It is going to be the, see, some are going to refer to it as validity. Some are going to refer to it as professional override. Basically, what this is saying is that no tool that we have is foolproof. And so with that, we want to make sure that we can take into consideration if we believe a juvenile or an adult for that matter is not being honest with us. We want to make sure we can override maybe some of the findings if we believe that child has not been honest with us. All right, so moving on to the most common sanction that we use in the juvenile justice system, and that is probation. Now, lots of folks are going to argue whether or not probation is cheaper or better. I'm going to argue that it is both. And so first, though, when we're talking about the goals of probation, our very first and primary goal is to protect the public. And so, and we see that again similar to being or what we have in the adult probation world. The second is that we want to hold juveniles accountable for their behavior. We can still hold folks accountable while they are on probation. And again, I would argue that being on probation is actually harder and more holding folks more accountable than if they were in prison. And then lastly, we really want to focus on giving kids a second chance. We want to focus on giving them the skills necessary to become a successful adult. And sometimes that requires giving them a second, third, fourth, even fifth chance to demonstrate that they can be successful. Now, with all of this, the U.S. Supreme Court, it was actually in what was known as the Olmstead decision in 1999, said we need to work within what is known as the least restrictive option available. So basically what that tells us is the Supreme Court is saying, don't let your first response be locking these kids up. Let's try the least restrictive option available, which is most often probation, and see if the child can be successful on that. If not, then we can intensify the maybe the level of security or supervision. Now we see a lot of fighting of this going on, or difference of opinions going on in politics. The conservative viewpoint generally is more on get tough on these kids, stop babying them, lock them up, give them a taste of incarceration, teach them a lesson. The liberal paradigm is focused more on community-based treatment and rehabilitation and giving those multiple chances. And so we have these two opposite ends of the spectrum, and they bicker back and forth, where ultimately the best scenario is going to be somewhere right in the middle. As I said earlier, in this graph in the bottom corner of your screen demonstrates, again, that probation is by far our most used option with juveniles as well as adults. This particular graph is specific to juveniles. You see probation being way the highest on the green, however, that has dropped dramatically. That drop is mainly due to crime rate decreases. You see residential placement has been pretty consistent. Other sanctions is the least, and that's been pretty consistent as well. In juvenile corrections, we do use graduated sanctions. That's that continuum of services. I've talked about graduated sanctions already, intermediate sanctions, where we progressively get more restrictive, and that's the same in the juvenile world. However, in the juvenile world, we're going to divide that into 4 different types. We have immediate sanctions, intermediate sanctions, confinement, and then aftercare. So first, let's take a look at immediate sanctions. A lot of times these are going to be diversion programs. Now, what this might be is after, let's say the police become involved with a juvenile. That police department or law enforcement agency might have options available to them that they can refer a juvenile to immediately. Or after that police contact, they get referred to the system, and the system might divert them to some type of specialty court, a teen court or a youth court or a specialized drug court. Or they might be referred to a restorative justice program. Restorative justice is alive and well and is probably used the most in the juvenile justice system. Now, for these immediate sanctions, the appropriate referral is going to be that probably first-time non-violent offender. And again, these do hold kids accountable. It makes them accountable a lot of times to their victim, which for children can sometimes be very, very effective. Now moving on to intermediate sanctions. These are, probation again is going to be the best example of an intermediate sanction. It's going to keep those kids, it still is a sentence, but it's going to keep those kids in the community with some supervision. As far as prevalence goes, again, I already talked about that. It is our most widely used sanction. We're seeing right now an increase in what is known as BARGE. Now, BARGE is an acronym for Balanced and Restorative Justice. Now, I've already talked about restorative justice at great length. It's that whole concept of bringing into consideration the victim, the offender, in this case it's the youth, as well as the community. And we sometimes look at that as a triangle. Balanced and restorative justice is really taking on another triangle because it's basically its goals are also threefold and correspond with those clients or those customers. And that we're trying to demonstrate accountability, competency development, as well as community safety. As far as accountability goes, again, we want to hold offenders accountable, and we can hold offenders accountable using restorative justice practices. As far as competency development, we want these youth to be better off when they leave us than when they came to us, whether that be in meeting their treatment goals, their education goals, their employment readiness goals, their family situation goals. We want them to be more competent when they leave us than when they come back to us. And at the same time, we want to keep the community safe. In doing all this, community safety, we still have a responsibility to protect the public, and so we're still going to be keeping that in mind while we are being successful in reaching these other goals. Why do we rely on probation so much and now this restorative justice process of probation? We truly believe that it is in the child's as well as the community's best interest to keep them involved, to keep them intact with their family, with their school, as well as their community. It is also extremely cost effective. Now, I already talked about that a little bit in talking about adult probation. In juveniles, we see the cost being a little bit more. To incarcerate a juvenile for a year can cost upwards of $50,000. Now, probation for juveniles is more expensive than the adult world. Some jurisdictions are guesstimating that it costs about $15,000 for a juvenile to be on probation for a given year, but no matter how much more it is based on juveniles versus adults, we still are money ahead. And our findings are that it is at least, if not more effective than other types of sanctions. As far as who, we see a lot of similarities here. Again, when we're determining who gets probation, we're going to take a look at the seriousness of the crime, their criminal history, their character, their family situation, the availability of resources. Sometimes communities don't have many resources for youth. So those are all the things that are going to be taken into consideration. With juveniles, we have a unique opportunity to have both formalized as well as informalized probation. Now, again, this is going to depend on the jurisdiction, and this can come in what we call the front end or the back end. Now, the front end, more informal, is going to be diversion programs, for example, that the police might have access to, where there might be an after-school program that they can be referred to, or some type of diversion program. Or the back end is going to be that formalized probation. They've gone through court, they've been adjudicated delinquent, and now they're going to be given probation as their sentence. Similar again to adults, juveniles or juvenile probation is being reconfigured in jurisdictions as community corrections. And again, we really focus on this whole idea of community and keeping youth in the community when we can, developing partnerships with community resources. As I said, if there's an after-school program or a treatment program already in the community that has a youth program, it only makes sense that we utilize those particular programs. With community corrections, it also allows us to involve the family. Now, some folks say that that's not fair, that we are then punishing the family. However, I am all for incorporating the family because in many, many cases, I would argue in most cases, we see this as a cycle. I knew I was getting old when I was beginning to work with youth or seeing youth coming into the system that I had worked with their parents, because we do see this as very much a cycle. And so we want to try to engage that family to see where's that family breaking down that we might be able to help. That really allows us to be individualized. We are going to look at each individual child and their individual family situation to figure out what's our next step, what is our best step. But at the same time, again, we are holding them accountable. And sometimes we need to hold the parents accountable. Some jurisdictions allow us to do that, to hold the parents accountable if their child messes up. And so engaging the family is really, really important. One of the other things that we're seeing being incorporated is called school-based probation. Now, education and education goals are generally the primary goal in a juvenile's probation plan. We want to focus on keeping these kids in school. And so it only makes sense that the best way to monitor their compliance with probation in this primary goal of education is to be at schools. And so we have many, many school districts that are cooperating with their local community corrections divisions and allowing us to have office space at the school. Because what better scenario to be able to focus on education and compliance with their plan than to actually be at the school. And so this is a partnership that we have had great success with. All right. We also, similar to adults, we have intensive supervision probation for juveniles. Same things apply. It's that highly controlled, lots of monitoring, very, very structured probation. We have smaller caseloads to allow us to have that intensity of supervision. And again, these are going to be for our highest risk kids. The kids that are most risk of reoffending or being safety issues might be a candidate for intensive supervision probation. We also use electronic monitoring for youth. A lot of times it's to monitor compliance of, are they sticking with their curfew? Are they going where they need to go? Again, it's generally pretty cost effective. It's much cheaper than incarcerating them. A lot of times it's used in combination with other types of sanctions. So if they have a sanction that says you need to do these community service hours here, it's going to allow us to make sure that they're there. If you're supposed to be at treatment here, it's going to allow us to monitor that. Some argue that electronic monitoring is discriminatory. This is also an argument for adults. Most jurisdictions require that the offender pay for their electronic monitoring, and it is not cheap. Some argue that's discriminatory. You have to be rich in order to afford it. That argument definitely has some truth to it. However, many jurisdictions are incorporating ability to pay. With youth, a lot of jurisdictions are covering that cost if the family can't afford to cover the cost of electronic monitoring. All right, switching gears then to juvenile institutions. When we're talking about detention centers, we have to remember the two parts of the definition. And again, this is something that we talk about a lot in the class Juvenile Justice. The first requirement is that it is temporary. Juvenile detention is never meant to be long-term. The second part of the definition is that it needs to be safe. That seems like a no-brainer, but depending on the jurisdiction and the type of institution, safety really needs to be a predominant factor. We generally are going to use detention centers for three things. The first is to make sure the person shows for court. Juveniles do not have the right to bail. And so again, we know that bail is used to ensure an adult shows up for court. We don't have that for juveniles, so one of the reasons that a juvenile might be sent to a detention center is if they can't afford bail. The second function is if they can't be sent home. If their victim lives in that home, or there are some huge challenges in the home and we don't feel it's in the child's best interest to send them there, we might opt for some type of detention center. And the third function of a detention center is to prevent harm, both to the child or to anyone else out in the community, whether it be family or non-family members. As far as detention center goes, we do see a lot of options there as far as types. We have secure detention facilities, we have non-secure, we have very, very short-term detention centers, as well as long-term. And again, remember this is meant to be temporary, but by long-term I'm saying they're capable of holding a juvenile maybe for a few months or even longer. No matter what type of detention center it is, all of them have to incorporate some type of educational component. All of them are required to have school in youth. One of the factors that we are very, very aware of is the risk of suicide. Basically, when a juvenile is in a detention center, they are at 4 times greater risk of suicide while they're in the facility than versus the general population. Now we know youth is our highest suicide demographic anyway. Now times that by 4, and that is what we have in a detention center. Detention centers are considered our most expensive option. I've already talked to that. It's about up to $50,000 per year. And it's considered our least successful as far as reducing recidivism. So those are all the things when the Supreme Court said you have to be or use the least restrictive option available. That's part of the reason that they based that decision on. Now, as I said earlier, juveniles do not have the right to jail, and so that came, or excuse me, the right to bail. That came out of a Supreme Court decision in 1984, Shaw versus Martin, that basically said preventative detention, which is holding someone to wait while waiting for court, is acceptable for juveniles when we have no feasible alternative. The court's preference is to send that juvenile home until their next court appearance, but we know sometimes that's just not an option. When we're talking about treatment for youth and some of the future trends, earlier I talked about adults and treatment, and in the adult world, treatment is considered a privilege. In the juvenile world, treatment is considered a right, and that comes from the Morales decision, which again was a landmark U.S. Supreme Court decision. Now, some people are going to argue whether or not treatment and punishment can happen at the same time. And really what we need to consider there is the benefits of treatment are always going to outweigh any of the consequences. And so that is why we really focus on treatment of youth. One of the things that sometimes makes this a little bit complicated is that youth tend to see treatment as part of their punishment. We do see that in adults as well, but we see this more predominantly with juveniles in that they see treatment as part of their punishment. They don't necessarily see the opportunity in treatment. They see it as just an extension of their punishment. So that's some of the things that we need to take into consideration when we're developing plans for youth. Some of the future trends, again, we are very much focused on keeping youth in the community. And so we are seeing more and more halfway houses or day treatment programs being developed for youth. Area learning centers, alternative schools, basically are being developed for youth to really try to keep the kids in the community, yet meeting all their risk and needs, yet outside of a institutional setting. And so with that, lots of non-secure residential programs are popping up in many jurisdictions, whether they be shelters, group homes, or increased use of foster homes. We're seeing a lot of need and communities responding to that need in developing these options. All right, then the last sector is juvenile parole. Now, many jurisdictions, including where I live in Minnesota, calls this aftercare. In the class Juvenile Justice, we talk about one of the challenges of learning about juvenile justice is it's a completely different vocabulary. We have the same process in the court system, but in the juvenile world, we're going to call it by a different name, which is just confusing, but it's the way it is. So in the juvenile world, we don't necessarily have parole. We call it aftercare. It's really the same thing, it's just a different name. It's still just for kids that have spent time in an institution, which again, remember, this is a very, very small fraction of kids that come into the system, but we still need to provide follow-up services for them. Similar to adult probation, there's lots of conditions on aftercare. One of the quotes that I read recently that really is disturbing, I think, is that aftercare is an afterthought. We put so much thought into trying to prevent juvenile crime and then diverting juveniles from the system, and then if they go into the system, how best can we deal with them, and coming up with a good plan, and if it's necessary that the kids go to an institution, what is going to best fit their needs. But what we lack in is developing a good plan for aftercare. So in a lot of respects, aftercare is an afterthought. But really what we're trying to do is fill that gap upon release, where we know that while they're incarcerated, obviously they are monitored and supervised 24/7. When they are reintegrating into society, we don't have that level of supervision, and how can we fill that gap? Similar to the adult world, we still have the same objectives. We want to protect the community. We want to help them in that adjustment to society. And ultimately, we want to reduce recidivism so they don't come back to us. Similar to adult world, again, when we're deciding when a juvenile is ready for aftercare, we're going to look at things at behavior, their progress in their plan, their attitude, what options are available in the community. And so this is a little bit different than the adult world. Remember, in the adult world, we talked about mandatory parole, discretionary parole. And in the adult world, we're really seeing mandatory parole where what the parole board thinks doesn't really matter. We have a date, and that's when we're going to release them. Discretionary parole or aftercare is what is used in the juvenile world, where we want to make sure the timing is right. We do see ourselves making some errors, though. Releasing someone too soon on aftercare basically increases their risk of recidivism. Keeping someone incarcerated too long and releasing them too late basically increases their chances of being institutionalized, where they just don't function well in the outside world, and that too increases their risk of recidivism. We've developed through research some best practices. Again, I talked a lot about evidence-based practices, and we see that being true in aftercare as well. Really providing wraparound services. We want to be comprehensive in developing an aftercare program. We want to make sure our plan is addressing their education, their employment, their family, their housing needs, their emotional needs, their recreational needs, drug treatment needs, if that's available. And so we want to make sure we are creating a plan that is taking into consideration every aspect of this kid's life. We also want to make sure that we are as long-term as possible, because here's one of the challenges we have is that it is very, very easy to be successful on aftercare for, let's say, 30 days, 40 days. Actually, the statistic out there is you're most at risk after 45 days. Now, it's very, very easy to be successful with aftercare for 30 days. You're released, you're excited about release, and you are dedicated to following all the rules. After about 30 days, you start to recognize, wow, this is really hard. I can't hang out with any of my old friends. I'm not having any fun. You know, what I used to do for fun involved crime or delinquency. And so, you know, my family's starting to get tired. You know, my mom's been, you know, my rock, but she's getting exhausted. She's got her own life to lead. And so, the average aftercare is 90 days. However, those first 45 days, kids really aren't that at risk. So, really, their aftercare effectiveness is only good for the next 45 days because the average is 90 days. The ideal situation would be that we provide aftercare services for up to 2 years upon their release. We simply can't afford that. And so one of the things that we're doing, again, similar to adults, remember in a previous lecture, I talked about that Second Chance Act of 2004. It's that reentry where we start working on their plan to be back into society the day they are institutionalized. And so those 3 phases that I talked about, if you need, go back, take a look at that other lecture, because that all applies to the juvenile world as well. All right, as far as treatment goes, we really want to focus on desistance. And ultimately, desistance is just the natural aging out that kids do. Generally speaking, by the time a child reaches about well, it varies. It's anywhere. Generally, when they reach the age of 18 to 20, they are naturally going to stop being delinquent or committing crime. And so desistance is they just age out of the criminal lifestyle. And so we always need to keep that in mind, that this is a natural progression that happens whether we do anything or not. We also see what we call the 9 effect. And now you're just going to have to put up with me. I had a 9 on the screen, and for some reason it didn't show up on the slide. So when we look at the number 9, I'm just going to, oops, this is not, that's not what I wanted. 1 second. All right. So if you draw, and I'm going to be doing this with my mouse, so bear with me. If you draw the number 9, we often use that to, sorry about that. I clicked it away. There we go. We often use this to talk about desistance. So where I started drawing the 9, so essentially right here, the 9 effect is a juvenile is going to come into the system right here. Let me change my font color so you can better see this. So a juvenile is going to come into the system right here, and then is going to go through the system, you know, contact with the police, maybe go to court, you know, sent to probation or some other sanction. And then when they're done with that, they never come back. Most juveniles have one act with the juvenile justice system, and then they're gone. So as far as we always need to keep that in mind, and that yeah, we want to be comprehensive and holistic, yet we need to know that for many of the youth that we're dealing with, this is a one-time deal and we'll never see them again regardless. And so those are some of the things that we're trying to balance, where we want to treat the symptoms, but we also want to make sure we're taking a look at the underlying causes. Again, remember we talked about static factors and dynamic factors. Some things we can change, some things we can't. However, even the things that we can't change might still be part of that cause. So how can we help to help them address those issues? And so Apologize, I have no idea what just happened. All right. I apologize for that. My computer just went blank. Um, anyway, so the APA, American Psychology Association, basically says begin as early as possible. There is some research that says, and we talk about this more in juvenile justice, that in hindsight, but of course hindsight is always 2020. There's some research that kids are showing some warning signs as far as future delinquency as early as age 3. Now we have to be careful. Just because a kid has a warning sign doesn't mean they're going to be a juvenile delinquent. But if there seems to be trends and patterns, if we can begin as early as possible. And addressing that early aggression, again, it's a huge red flag. Early aggression has been identified as one of the key red flags for future delinquency. Correlation doesn't mean causation. Just because a kid has aggression as a child doesn't mean they're going to become a future criminal, but we do see some patterns there. Being holistic, as I talked about, all aspects of their life. Again, our plan needs to address all aspects of life. The last one is either called windows of opportunity or crisis intervention. Basically, when a kid is in a really, really tough situation, when they're in tough times, they are more open to help. And so basically, we're taking advantage of a bad situation because it's really a window of opportunity to get kids into some type of program. Now we've talked if you've had the class of criminology or again juvenile justice, we talk about several approaches. Social learning approaches basically takes into consideration what learning environments a child has had so far. And so social learning is the context in which this child has learned. And so we need to take that in consideration when developing their treatment plan. As far as family therapy goes, again, if we can, we want to involve the family as much as possible. Using cognitive approaches. Again, remember, cognitive is how you think. And ultimately, if we can change a juvenile's thinking pattern, we most often can reduce recidivism. And then crisis intervention. Again, normally when kids come to us, it is in response to some type of crisis situation. And so that really opens a window of opportunity for treatment. And just kind of a last minute closing thought, doing assessment, making sure our assessment is thorough and effective is really absolutely the key, because by doing assessing those risks and assessing those needs, it's really going to allow us to get to those underlying factors and causes. I use that term loosely, but trying to figure out what are the issues that are leading this child to become delinquent. And then once we've done that, using what works. Again, evidence-based practices is a major success right now in the adult world. It's also very, very successful in the juvenile world. We've got programs that work. One of probably the most successful programs is cognitive behavioral modification. Again, that's really focusing on changing a child's thinking pattern. And what the best piece about that is that juveniles are generally more receptive. Cognitive behavioral modification does work in the adult world, but it's challenging because it's sometimes difficult to change how an adult thinks. Juveniles are still young, they're still developing, and they're still developing their thinking patterns. And so that gives us a great opportunity to intervene early and intervene quickly and help them develop better habits in how they make their decisions. And that's really where we've become most successful. All right. So